So, hey everyone, good evening. Welcome to our very first ever Velocity Eve celebration. So excited to be kicking off this inaugural event and have you all joining us. My name is Max Cedar. I'm one of the VPs of Allyship here with the Women's Business Connection at UCLA Anderson. So as you all may know, Velocity is an annual conference hosted by Anderson that's really about celebrating the power and impact of women in the business world and beyond, and bringing together current and future leaders of all backgrounds to explore ideas for a more equitable future in business and in society. So in order to best explore these ideas, we wanted to involve and engage our ally community, and we've worked hard to make this year's conference more inclusive of all genders, including men, women, and non-binary attendees. So with that in mind, we wanted to expand our programming and host a dedicated session the evening before the Full Velocity Conference tomorrow for a conversation on how allies can help empower and celebrate the impact of women. We're very excited to have Fran Benjamin and Heather Caruso with us here tonight to kick us off with a really great fireside chat. So a bit about our speakers. Fran Benjamin is a 2014 alumni of UCLA Anderson, where he was an organizational behavior fellow. Fran served as the vice president and head of people for Grail Inc., one of the world's fastest growing life sciences technology startups dedicated to early cancer detection. From 2017 to 2021, Fran guided the Lauded Unicorn company through nearly 4x employee growth, financing of over $1.5 billion, an IPO, and the eventual acquisition by Illumina for $8 billion. Fran recently transitioned roles and is currently a managing partner at GoodWorks Consulting, where he has the opportunity to pursue his true passion, equity, diversity, and justice consulting for a whole host of different organizations across different fields. Fran has navigated the executive ranks as a non-binary queer person and utilizes this unique experience combined with leading edge research and practical industry expertise to advise clients to successfully traverse the complexities of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging throughout their organizations. Fran is also committed to the work of anti-racism while examining and challenging his own position of power and privilege. So we're really, really excited to have Fran with us this evening. Moving on, Heather Caruso. Heather joined UCLA Anderson in 2018 as Assistant Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Scholar and researcher of organizational behavior, Heather teaches highly sought after classes in the management and organizations and behavioral decision-making areas. Layering rigorous academic training on top of practical experience, Dean Caruso grounds her interest in the areas of effective collaboration, especially for cross-functional and multicultural teams. She also focuses on skilled improvisation in leadership, management of identity, power and influence, and strategies for optimal choice, as well as judgment and decision-making. Prior to UCLA Anderson, Heather focused on these topics in over a decade of teaching, research, administration, and scholarship at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Welcome, Heather. We're so excited to have these two incredible speakers with us this evening and look forward to hearing their unique perspectives in this conversation, with Heather as an accomplished academic and Fran as a seasoned practitioner, not to mention Anderson alum. With that said, I will now turn it over to Fran and Heather for our fireside chat. Please take it away.
Thank you, Mac. And thanks, Fran, for being here. Thanks to everybody for joining us. I'm so excited to kick off Velocity with this happy hour. This is a brand new sort of adventure for us, and we're really happy that you're here to share it with us. I'd love to open up our conversation by just inviting you, Fran, if you'd like to sort of share your thoughts on some of the content, the topics that we're going to be sending people out into breakout rooms to discuss after our chat. We're going to have them talk about reviews and promotions and where bias can show up there. We're going to have them talk about mentorship and experiences for women of color, all with a lens of sort of where can allyship make a difference and what are the things that that people can do to be better allies, to help sort of invite and coach people into being better allies where that's appropriate. My sense is a lot of your work has given you a sort of a front lines view of this. What are your initial thoughts just on that landscape?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll start just by saying I'm so happy to be virtually back after a handful of years not being on campus, and I'm just really pleased to be here. It's interesting, this topic of allyship. I'm by no means an expert, and in many ways, I think I've come to where I've come to today because of people being allies to me, and so we're constantly learning about how to do this well, and how to show up on behalf of others. So I think that we can make this a dialogue about what we're seeing now, knowing that it will continue to evolve. These are some really interesting topics and complex, and I think having sat in the head of people seat and seeing the ways in which bias can show up be it performance reviews or mentoring, it's hard to observe and pin down the subtlety, and sometimes from what I understand, it's even hard for people that are experiencing bias to really identify and acknowledge it as true, valid, and to not sit in doubt or self questioning. And so it can be subtle. It can also be very quite frankly, obvious as well. When I think about performance reviews, one of the things that I've been very deliberate about and encourage business leaders to be deliberate about is to take time to calibrate across talent and have the hard conversations about how bias might be showing up in the process of performance reviews. So we know that we tend to, particularly in the candidate experience, but this also translates into evaluating incumbent talent within organizations. We know that we tend to apply varying criteria or varying levels of scrutiny for different identity characteristics. So women tend to be held to a higher standard to prove their work than men tend to be. And so if we take in performance reviews the opportunity to pause, look at talent holistically amongst a group of leaders to say, are we using the same yardstick for folks that represent multiple identity characteristics, that can be critically important. And also just taking the time, because when bias creeps in is often when we're moving very quickly. And so a lot of organizations, and performance reviews are a complicated topic today. Ratings, no ratings, how do we conduct them annually? Are they developmental in nature? Are they performance-based? But regardless of how you're doing them or to what end, taking the time to calibrate across talent. And I'll say that the more that we can, in those calibration conversations, advocate on behalf of folks that are not of our affinity groups or identity characteristics is extremely important. And I'll just use an anecdote to talk about this about myself. There have been not that many instances in my career where I felt greater relief than a time where I sat in a calibration conversation and had a straight cis white male share, when we were reviewing the performance of a queer person, are we challenging that person's leadership style appropriately? Are we holding this person to a prototype of what we view to be leadership that isn't appropriate, and is bias creeping in because this person is queer? And I didn't say this, but as the queer person in the room, I felt such a sense of support and relief for that man to give voice to this important topic. And so I think those are the unique opportunities that we have to lean in and step in, to call people into a complicated conversation.
I couldn't agree more. And you've said so many interesting things. I want to just sort of highlight a couple and see if we want to go any deeper. One of them is, I think, the very important point of having organizations take time for this. But one of the challenges that I think a lot of leaders will face is not knowing how much time is enough time. And so trying to put some specificity on these kinds of sort of points of guidance has proven to be a significant challenge. And I from my read of the research, from the work that I do as an educator, I find it helpful to think about two different things that you're trying to make time for. And one of them you make time for kind of periodically and in retrospect, because bias isn't really a thing that you can detect with the sort of single decision that's in front of you, right? It's sort of unless you're in the unusual position of being able to run a randomized controlled trial kind of like right there in the moment and make all the decisions kind of in rapid fire, you're usually deciding on one position at a time with a limited number of candidates that you recruited in a particular way. And you can't say, if I had recruited them in some other less biased way, would I be making a different choice, right? So there's time that you want to insert on a regular basis that you want to plan for, where you look back how you've been making decisions across different kinds of identity groups, in ways that might reveal, am I treating people who are coming in through different referral channels differently? Am I more lenient when people are, employee referred versus when they come in through a recruiter or something along those lines? Am I less sensitive to diversity when I'm looking at employee referrals instead of recruiter referrals, things like that. And that I think is in some ways easier to make time for because it's not in the moment. It's a sort of a constant retrospective effort. And of course, you hope to do it often enough that you can affect, future hiring cycles. So it depends a little bit on how fast that turnover is in your firm. But something that you can do in the moment, or a little bit more in the moment, is think about taking time to check in with people to make sure that they feel fairly treated in the process, right? And I think the hiring process and the promotion process are both places where there can be a high degree of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of concern about sort of informal information that might be being shared with some and not others. And I think we often wait a little too long to check in with people, make sure that they feel like they have all the information that they need, that they understand the criteria, that, if they want to have any, if they want to ask any questions, they know who they can go to. I loved your point about calibration and how I think a lot of the work that's being done in diversity these days is about encouraging people to have the calibration conversation, not just because it would help sort of bring in a more diverse workforce, but it's really just a wise business practice to make transparent what it is you value. Because sometimes when you just go through the exercise of making it transparent, you realize, that's not actually what we intended. It just it turns out this is what we've been responding to. This is what we've been just sort of like letting in the door just because it seemed right, because we have always been doing it. But if we really think deliberately about the firm that we want to be in the future, this isn't really related to that. This isn't really taking us in that direction. And so sometimes it can be a good way of taking the organization off of autopilot and better matching your recruiting strategies to the production goals that you have in the future, the creativity goals, the innovation goals, and stuff like that. Does that resonate with what you're seeing?
Yeah, very much. And I think that a lot of the work that we put in place for objectivity and the intended outcome of mitigating bias is so I believe that there is sort of justice to be done for historical inequities, particularly in the corporate space, and also this objectivity is good for business. And I think that like what you're describing is extremely true. Taking the time to be objective in these ways is good. Period. And I also think that it's interesting to sort of traverse the systems level work that we do to create processes that are equitable and objective, and also the interpersonal work that we do to think about belonging and like establish human connection, because we don't get to leave any component piece of ourselves at the door when we walk into our organizations or Zoom now. And so remembering that there is a deeply human experience of encountering one another, and to your point, checking in with how what is any individual's experience of going through these processes within organizations like. It signals, it helps to provide safety signals, identity safety signals in organizations. It helps to build culture and create a sense of, I can feel welcome and be welcome in this space. I also think that it has an interesting tie into the notion of mentorship and sponsorship. Having someone who is uniquely invested in that interpersonal dynamic, and I'm curious, Heather, what you've seen in the research or in the academic framework or in practice about how that interpersonal and relationship shows up from a standpoint of bias and allyship related to mentorship.
So I think mentorship is absolutely critical. It is one of the relatively few sorts of programs, initiatives that have been pretty robustly related to increases in diversity hiring and retention over time. So I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that mentorship programs are worth investing in. That being said, a mentorship program can look a lot of different ways. And so you can think about the need for guidance as being pretty universal. And then you probably want to get a little bit more granular, a little bit more sort of idiosyncratic when you're thinking about, all right, so what does effective guidance look like in our space? Because there are going to be situations where you want to match based on identity group. So for example, there's some evidence to suggest that if you're talking about very sort of young or inexperienced people coming into relatively new roles where there's a lot of anxiety around just basic belonging. Can I even get in the door? Is it totally crazy for me to want to do this? That kind of level of anxiety, then matching based on identity groups can be really reassuring, right up, just letting you know, all right, somebody else with similar kinds of background characteristics has gotten to a place where they feel like they can give back and they can help others come up to speed. It's not the only way that you can create that kind of belonging, but it's a nice, relatively quick way because they're right there kind of in the flesh, just, being evidence that you can be it. So that I think is useful, especially in the early stages. When you see people at more senior levels, they tend to be less concerned about the kind of whether or not I belong in this general domain and more about how specifically, tactically, do I get to the next level? They're a little more seasoned. I think they're in that situation, people who just matching people based on know-how, who has the information that can get them to that next level, who has the networks that can help them build the relationships that can help them, create that set of assets that can put them in line for the more senior positions. That tends to be more important than just the sort of simple identity matching. So I think mentorship is a huge piece of it, even outside of formal mentorship programs. I think anything that you can do to help people feel like I know that I'm here in a kind of complete way. I'm here just like everybody else is here. My presence here isn't conditional. So I think one of the things that's a little bit sort of just challenging for people who are running EDI programs is the concern that when people are brought in under one of these programs, that they'll feel like they're kind of like a special class of citizens in the organization and worry about a sort of second class citizen standing, and certainly that's exacerbated when sort of majority group members in the room also develop that suspicion and that, and then can make comments that are disempowering. So one of the things that's really important for allies in the organization who are excited to see this kind of support being created for people who have been disadvantaged by historical inequities is to really celebrate that they're there, not just to correct the historical inequities, but just because it's nice to have them there. We too often forget it's just nice to interact with people who are interesting, and being different is one of the easiest ways to be interesting. It's just, in some ways, it's a really simple concept. I think, we have a decent amount of evidence from psychology to suggest that actually people have a pretty natural attraction to what is new, what is interesting and different, what we can learn from. And that a lot of the negative reactions that people end up having from diversity come from layers that come on top of that, where, in order to interact with someone who is from a different background, there are sort of issues of, historical group loyalties and antagonism that, that kind of layer in and get in between you and the other person, in a sense. And a lot of, I think, what organizations need to do, what society needs to do, is to try to remove as many of those layers as possible, so that when you're interacting with a new person, you're just going to get to know that person with as few preconceived notions about how the two of you are supposed to get along or not, right? So I think to the extent that mentors can give people hope for that, and give people more concrete guidance on, how to reach out, start making some friends in the organization, start getting the information that you need. It's simple, but really powerful way to build that belonging.
Beautiful. I'm also interested in this, the distinction between mentorship and sponsorship, and thinking about, power and privilege, and when folks are in a position of power and privilege, the social and organizational capital that they have to spend, and how they can spend that on behalf of someone else as a sponsor. And so I think about the distinction between mentorship and sponsorship, as mentorship is a sort of interpersonal relationship that provides guidance and provides advisement and provides some coaching, and sponsorship as slightly different in that a sponsor will pound the table on behalf of the person being sponsored, and will spend their social capital to advance that person, because they are personally invested in their success. And I think that I have seen great, sort of practically speaking, in the organizations that I've worked in, I've seen great returns on that investment, and also for folks that are historically underrepresented in organizations, they tend not to, at least in my observation, they tend not to naturally have a sponsor, as majority group members tend to naturally sort of gravitate to a sponsor that will do that work of spending their social capital on them. And so I think when it comes to bias and when it comes to equity in organizations, mentorship is critically important for all of the reasons that you just said. And I also am really interested in sponsorship on this topic as well, and curious if what you're seeing on that, or any thoughts.
One of the things, there's a lot in that space, but one of the things that stands out to me most is how seldom people recognize that they're in a position to be a sponsor. And part of that, I think, is just the way that ordinary privilege kind of lurks in the background, and you don't recognize that you've got it. You don't recognize that it helped you get you where you are. And so you think about, a lot of senior people in an organization. Let's take a sort of as an example, a sort of a senior white male who, because of those identity groups, on top of whatever other competencies that person has, probably found fewer barriers, or would have faced fewer barriers getting to a senior position than somebody from a historically marginalized group, but wouldn't have been informed of that. At least in recent years, that person wouldn't necessarily have been told at some point, because you're a white male, we're going to give you this next step up. And so, remains only conscious of the competence that they bring to the table, which might be considerable. But then, to sort of thinking about women or others in the organization who are not of that identity group, or from those identity groups, who are also trying to make it. And, you can imagine that person looking at other, highly competent, say a highly competent woman of color, and thinking, all right, well, you're going to rise up just like I did, because what's supported here is competence. And then if it doesn't, if a person doesn't actually achieve that, if that doesn't happen, I think sometimes, the ambiguity of performance evaluations and progress in corporations, it happens on such a long timeline.
Mhm.
That sometimes you're like, oh, I don't know why she's not moving up. Maybe something's going wrong, like, but it's not going to be obvious to you that no one is highlighting her accomplishments. No one's noticing her accomplishments the way that they might notice somebody's who's from a majority identity group, right? And so they don't recognize, like, they're just sort of like often in a position where they're sort of standing on the sidelines, quizzically wondering why it is that people aren't moving up and the diversity isn't kind of happening naturally, not recognizing that part of it is just people standing on the sidelines just watching, instead of saying, hey, look, oh my God, this is fantastic. Look at, we have people here with incredible competence, and especially when it's people who have identity groups that would have placed them in a position of historical disadvantage. Oh my God, you guys, like, why are we not seizing this? Like that kind of like joy. Even if they feel it internally, often isn't something that just sort of comes out. Sometimes I think because people just don't recognize like that would matter to anybody, because you know what I mean. It's sort of not a salient part of their own success. So really, there's been some wonderful work done on just helping people to recognize when their voice matters, when they have standing in the room to comment on something, especially in diversity issues, which sometimes at a very superficial level can be read as issues for people from marginalized groups to speak about, but people from majority groups don't speak about that. I hope that sort of superficial interpretation goes away, and that people start to realize these are not issues for any particular group, but really issues for sort of everybody in the workforce, everybody in society. And then the question is really, what are the many things that you can comment on? What are the many things that you can have questions about and express express questions about to one another? It's about being in a constant conversation, because we're not looking to get to some top of the mountain like place where like everything is perfect and then everybody shuts off and we never talk about diversity again. The point is to become a society where we can come together around our differences and with the same excitement and joy as we bring to coming together around our common ground. Right? Like the conversations we've all been taught to have since we were kids, where if you want to make friends, like find out if they like something that you like, and then if you do, it's like, oh great, I like that too. And like we know how to have the conversation where we celebrate common ground. We don't really yet know how to have the conversation where we celebrate our differences and where we can ask that follow-up questions like, oh my goodness, I don't know anything about that. Tell me more, or whatever that is. And that means, if we learn that skill set, then even if there are meaningful, significant differences between us, we always can have something to be in conversation about. We always have a question we can ask and a comment we can make, an appreciation we can give, even if it's just appreciation for, geez, I just didn't know that. Thank you for just being here and bringing that closer to me.
Yeah, I think that point it sort of is something that reminds me of something that I think is really important to acknowledge, which is that this work is messy. It is by nature going to be messy, and so the appreciation and also the willingness to apologize and clean up any messiness that's created, and acknowledging that up front, that you're going to do that hard work, I think is really important. And then and I think it's somewhat related to your comment about this is the diversity, equity, inclusion conversation is not a conversation just for those that have historically been underrepresented in organizations. And frankly, if it is, we have a problem because we're asking the people that have been marginalized and oppressed in the system to solve the problem on behalf of the majority group members. And it also reminds me of since we're talking about mentorship, this notion of reverse mentorship, and so I imagine that I'll say I have been asked to be a reverse mentor in the past, and perhaps folks on the call have had that experience as well of being asked to do like skip level mentoring of someone who is organizationally higher up in the hierarchy than you are, and try to sort of impart your experience to them and things like that. And I think that the sort of dialogue there is critically important, but also if you are seeking to be reverse mentored by someone in your organization, to learn from their experience, the delicate balance of not burdening the folks that have been potentially excluded from the system in the past, of educating you on the experience of their oppression, as well as on the experience of or how to fix the problem. And so it's an interesting topic, and people are. I've been in conversations a lot about mentorship. How? Reverse mentorship? Do we do it? Sponsorship? Like what version of this, and how does it impact the people involved? And this question of reverse mentorship, therefore, always gives me pause. Not that it shouldn't happen, but if it's going to happen, there needs to be some sort of social contract involved about what we're asking of the people involved. And I'm curious what thoughts you have about that.
Oh, so many. Fran and I were talking before the call and in prep calls about how 45 minutes was not nearly going to be enough, because every time we get together, we want to talk to for hours.
Yes.
So I will try to keep it more brief and say, I think that this is an area where society has an opportunity to get complicated in a really good way. We had a listening session for members of our AAPI community a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that came up in that was that some organizations tackle these issues with a sort of like, all right, how do I fix it? Kind of mentality, and I think we bring that, especially at Anderson, we've got a lot of doers, we got a lot of achievers. They want to figure out how to solve the problem, and as I mentioned, this is not a thing where there's like a solution where we're going to, sort of end it and then be all done. And I think one of the things that gets wrapped up in reverse mentorship that hurts the effort is some notion of tell me how to fix it, tell me how to be better. Like there's a destination I'm going to get to, and then I'm done. It's funny when people use this term educate. Like you've got to educate people. And, I am an educator. I only really want to educate in the classroom. Like, I think there's a place for a sort of a pedagogical relationship where like, I am an expert and I have some information and I'm going to share that information. And of course, all classrooms should be something of a dialogue, but there's a place where I have the desire to have that sort of expert learner, teacher learner kind of relationship. In other non-explicitly educational spaces, I just want to talk to people and I just want to be heard, and I want them to be able to talk and I want them to be heard. And so I think when I think about reverse mentorship, when I think about people learning more about the experiences of women of color, of other historically marginalized groups, I would just say, why don't we create just a type of conversation where it's just about learning about them, and don't ask them to speak for everybody else. If they step up and they're like, hey, I feel like I want to take on that larger role of educator. Okay. But I think in a lot of cases, you're going to see a deep appreciation for can you just tell me about what you're going through?
Yeah.
Can you tell me about how it's been, how you're, is there anything I could do for you? Just it's enough just to have to speak about your own personal experience and the places where you feel overlooked. And I think if we do that and we encourage, learn about the individuals, one thing you will learn is that individuals are different. that the thing we all know, but haven't really as a society come to terms with in our behavior is, these big boxes that we, lump people into. Even when I was just saying, we brought together our AAPI community, like that community is hugely diverse.
Yes.
I would love to see a community, a society, a set of dynamics where, we bring together people around the interests and the conversations that they want to have, and we welcome them to bring in whatever identities are salient to them. But it's not a presumption that we bring to the table, and it's not a a lesson we're trying to learn. Tell me about what it's like to be AAPI, and like give me the lesson, and then I'll take my test, and then I'll like check off my box and I'll be done. It's, it's just, in some ways, I think a lot of the power and the impact, the longstanding impact of the advocacy groups is raising the salience of a set of experiences to the point where we start to realize, oh my God, there's a ton there that hasn't been paid attention to. Let's break it all apart into all the little, sort of individual experiences and treat people like individuals. Give everybody that privilege of humanity.
Yes. And so from an allyship standpoint, if you are an ally in conversation with someone, it sounds like what we're saying here is see that person. See that person for who they are, get to know them, invest the time, and perhaps even like the categorizations that we're so used to are sort of superfluous in those conversations. Not that don't mishear me. Not that things like color blindness. I don't see race. Like you are the complexities that make you who you are, including all of those categories. But I have a human being sitting before me. Who are they? Exactly. How can I help? What's new? It can go an incredibly long way.
Right? It's like, I think it's useful to have some sensitivity to the fact that groups have been historically discriminated against just on the basis of their identity. I think it's useful to have some sensitivity to the fact that continues to happen in today's society to varying degrees in different places. So you wouldn't want to. So I think it's useful to be able to encounter people with a sense that there might be a lot of complexity to their story. There might be pain. There might be a feeling of marginalization that comes out in a lot of different ways, but not to necessarily assume more than that.
Right.
But use it as a prompt to say, let me ask the question. Let me check in and see how people are doing. Let me do it before, there's some kind of crisis and they're about to leave the company or something along those lines. This is going to sound like it's a little bit to the side of it, but I do see it as related. A dear friend of mine recently lost his adult daughter to cancer, which is, not the kind of thing you prepare for. And it's not the kind of thing that people can see. Like in his organization, people sort of knew and then, could be a little bit more sensitive. But he wrote at one point talking about how the feeling of walking through the organization carrying around this pain made him realize that his pain wasn't visible on the outside. And then it made him think about all the other pain that people might be carrying around in the organization that he never saw because it's not visible on the outside. And we had a really good conversation about that because I think that just that kind of compassion would do all of us so much good. And, and I don't want to sort of harp on just the negative. People are carrying around a lot of light too, and a lot of goodness and a lot of potential that never gets seen. But I think if we could really absorb the reality that we can see so little of one another on the outside, and that there's a lot that's in there, and there's a lot, and it's complex. And just as you say, sort of see that person, be willing to take the time. I think being a really great ally or even a sponsor going that far to one person can be so transformative in a life, right? If you could just do that one thing really, really well, like really see it through, that'd be enough. You know what I mean? Like I would be happy. I would feel like the world is a better place, I think. And to the extent that you have privilege and it enables you to do it for many people, I mean, it's such a good for the society, but I predict, both based on personal sort of anecdote and research, that it will feel amazing, that allyship will just feel so good, especially when it's not done performatively. It's not done because people are looking at you to do it, but because you're like, this is a thing I can do. And it would be, I think, fulfilling to be part of bringing that diversity and all the joy and all of the discovery that comes with it into our space.
Yeah. I think to this point about seeing the person that is sitting before you, the third topic that we have in our breakout groups shortly coming is about the experience of women of color, and that is talk about not enough time, and so what comes to mind for me is just this notion of intersectionality, that the intersection of, in this case, gender and race is critically important for how an ally shows up in relationship to someone else. And as for me, as a mostly male presenting white person, getting extremely curious about and frankly centering the experience of women of color, because that experience tends to not get centered all sorts of places, but in my field, in organizations, is very important. And also the one thought that I have about allyship is be steadfast. Like, I'm thinking about an anecdote about women of color raising issues within an organization, and the question being raised: is that a valid concern? Is that really would the majority support that concern? And I think steer clear of gaslighting as an ally, as well as an underrepresented person in an organization, and just be steadfast in support of the folks that you're advocating on behalf of when you're questioned like that. But Heather, what else comes to mind?
Oh, again, so many
I
things.
know.
But you on the gaslighting point, you raised something so fascinating, because in general, I'm a fan of free and open conversation. I like it when people can speak their mind. I think it's really important to, the gaslighting conversation has made people aware of the way in which our words can hurt. So in a free society, in a society where we value, sort of open dialogue, that's not a license just to be like, I'm going to sort of turn off any filter and like just indifferent to the impact of my words. But I would love for our society to find ways for people to ask questions that are genuinely on their mind, even maybe questions that come off as insensitive, but be pushed to sort of work through that with the people they're in conversation with. Because I worry about situations where we just say, don't ask that question because it's a bad question, because the people who ask them are often asking it because it seems like a completely reasonable question. And if they're just sort of told to sort of obey politeness norms or political correctness norms, right? Like you lose an opportunity for authentic dialogue. And then we go back to this issue of sort of, how much education or sort of how much do you want to put it on the person who's just been offended?
Yes.
And my answer is not at all. I think if people are like, I'm done, I don't want to have this conversation, I think you get to say, I'm done and I don't want to have this conversation. But I almost want that. I want organizations where people can say, I find that really offensive, I'm going to have to step away. And that is a cue that people are that they take, and you say, oh, geez, like I just offended somebody. Let me go ask somebody else if they can help me figure that out, and sort of give the other person as much time, maybe all the time in the world, depending on what it is, right? But I wouldn't want the conversation to just kind of fade to black and end there, and like we never speak of it again. Like it's important that organizations, right, not the individual, right, but that the organizations create some competency around, just as you said before, people are going to make mistakes. We're definitely going to make mistakes. We are, in diversifying our organization, setting us up. We're setting everyone up to make more mistakes than we did before, right? We're going to take you out of easy street, like right, like where all this stuff, and we're going to intentionally keep filling the organization with people that you have nowhere near that like level of experience interacting with. So for sure, you're going to make mistakes. Let's talk about the kinds of ways you react when inevitably you step on someone's toes, you make some insensitive remark, you blub, and then we talk about boundaries, and you're like, there are some things you just cannot do. that's like their deal breakers. But inside the deal breakers territory, there's a process, and that process is probably going to involve some intense and heated moments, but there's a process that's designed for you to learn, for everybody to get better at working together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that. Get better at working together. What a note to end on.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sad that we're out of time, but we are. So I think I'm supposed to send it back to Mac, and you're going to help us transition.
Well, yeah. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really, really incredible and inspiring to hear all of your experiences and insights there. So on behalf of everyone listening in, thank you so much for your time this evening.